Welcome back to Whispers of a Grieving Ghost, the channel where we give voice to the stories that were silenced far too soon. Every shadow holds a secret, every quiet home a potential for a story that the world needs to hear, not just as a tale of horror, but as a lesson, a warning, a plea for the vigilance we owe to the most vulnerable among us. The story we are about to unfold is a particularly harrowing one, a journey into the darkest corners of a family's home, where the lines between protector and predator blurred into a nightmare. It's a story that will make you question everything you think you know about a mother's love. We delve into these difficult narratives to honor the victims and to ensure their light, however brief, continues to shine, illuminating the darkness for others. If you believe in the power of these stories, in the importance of bearing witness, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support allows us to continue this vital work. Click that subscribe button and ring the bell for notifications so you never miss a voice that needs to be heard. Now, prepare yourself as we step into the life of a little boy whose trust was betrayed in the most unimaginable way, in a story we call Mother Hid the Truth, Stepfather's Abuse and the Chilling Murder of Her Own Flesh and Blood. The first time Sarah noticed the light in her 7-year-old son's eyes begin to dim, it wasn't a sudden eclipse, but a slow, almost imperceptible fading, like a photograph left too long in the sun. Leo, once a supernova of a child, a whirlwind of laughter, questions, and scraped knees, had started to fold in on himself. It began, she would later tell herself, shortly after Mark moved in. Mark, her husband, the man who had swept into her life like a much-needed storm, washing away the lingering loneliness of a single mother struggling to make ends meet. He was handsome, charismatic, with a smile that seemed to physically straighten her weary shoulders. He was wonderful with Leo, or so it had seemed. In the beginning, they were the perfect trio, a tableau of a happy, blended family. Mark would hoist Leo onto his broad shoulders, their shared laughter echoing through their small, newly hopeful home. He taught Leo how to skip stones across the creek behind their house, his patience seemingly endless as the boy's clumsy throws sent rocks plopping inches from the shore. Sarah had watched them from the kitchen window, her heart swelling with a gratitude so fierce it bordered on painful. She had done it. She had given her son a father, a stable home, the life she had always dreamed for him. She was so caught up in the beautiful picture they made that she failed to notice the subtle changes in the composition, the darker hues beginning to bleed into the canvas. The first tangible sign was the bedwetting. Leo, who had been dry at night since he was 3, started having accidents. The first time, Sarah had been gentle, stripping the sheets without a word of admonishment, her mind attributing it to a late-night juice box or a simple childhood regression. Mark had been less understanding. "He's too old for this, Sarah," he'd said, his voice a low grumble from the doorway of Leo's room. "You're babying him. He needs discipline." Sarah had bristled at the word. "He's just a little boy, Mark. It was an accident." Mark had sighed, a sound of put-upon patience that was becoming increasingly familiar. He walked over, ruffled Leo's hair with a hand that seemed a little too rough, and said, "Big boys don't wet the bed, do they, champ?" Leo, huddled in his fresh pajamas, had simply stared at the floor, his small shoulders hunched. He didn't answer. He just nodded, a tiny, jerky movement. That was new. Her once boisterous son had become quiet, his answers to questions often reduced to nods and shakes of the head. Then came the bruises, small, inexplicable marks that would appear on Leo's arms and legs. A purplish smudge on his bicep, a faint yellowing bloom on his shin. When she asked, Leo's explanations were always vague, childishly plausible. "I fell off the swings. I bumped into my desk at school. Me and Tommy were wrestling." Sarah, wanting to believe, accepted these explanations. Kids were clumsy. They played hard. It was normal. Mark would back him up, often with a hearty laugh. "He's all boy, that one. A regular little roughneck." He'd sling an arm around Leo, pulling him into a tight side hug. Sarah would see her son flinch, a barely perceptible tightening of his body, before relaxing into the embrace. Or was she imagining it? She must be. She was so terrified of something going wrong, of this perfect life she'd built shattering, that she was seeing monsters in the shadows. But the shadows were growing longer. Leo started to have nightmares. He would wake up screaming, his small body drenched in sweat, his eyes wide with a terror he couldn't articulate. He'd cling to Sarah, his sobs racking his frame, but he could never tell her what he was dreaming about. The monster was all he would whisper, his face buried in her neck. The monster is coming. Mark was always dismissive of the nightmares. Attention-seeking, he'd diagnose, standing in the hallway with his arms crossed. He knows you'll come running. You need to be firm with him, Sarah. Let him cry it out. He needs to learn to self-soothe. His words, always delivered with an air of confident authority, made her feel foolish, overprotective. He was a man, after all. He knew about raising boys. Her own father had been a distant figure. Her knowledge of boyhood gleaned from books and a deep, instinctual love. Mark made her feel like that love was a weakness, a flaw in her parenting that he needed to correct. So, she tried Mark's way. One night, when Leo's terrified screams echoed from his room, she stayed in bed, her body rigid, her knuckles white as she gripped the sheets. Mark's hand was on her back, a heavy, possessive weight. "Let him be," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "It's for his own good." Every scream was a physical blow, a shard of glass in her heart. She lay there, listening, until the cries subsided into whimpering, and then into a silence that felt more terrifying than the noise. The next morning, Leo had a dark circle under one of his eyes and he wouldn't look at her. The light in his eyes had dimmed a little more. The shift in their family dynamic was insidious. Mark's discipline became more pronounced. It was never in front of her, not at first. It was always a man-to-man talk in another room. It was Leo being sent to his room for minor infractions, like spilling his milk or leaving his toys out. The timeouts grew longer. Sometimes, when she'd go to check on him, she would find him sitting on his bed, his hands folded in his lap, staring at the wall with an unnerving stillness. She tried to talk to Mark about it, to voice the unease that was taking root in her gut. "Don't you think you're being a little hard on him?" she'd asked one evening, her voice carefully neutral. Mark didn't even look up from the television. "I'm trying to instill some discipline, Sarah. Something that's been lacking. He needs a strong hand. He needs to learn respect." "He respects you," she insisted, though even as she said it, she knew the word was wrong. Leo didn't respect Mark. He feared him. The way he would startle when Mark entered a room. The way his eyes would dart to his stepfather before speaking. The way he would instinctively shrink back when Mark's hand came near him. These were not signs of respect. They were the hallmarks of fear. One Saturday afternoon, things escalated. Sarah was in the garden, pulling weeds, when she heard a loud crash from inside the house, followed by Mark's enraged roar and Leo's terrified shriek. She scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding against her ribs, and ran inside. She found them in the living room. A shattered lamp lay on the floor, its ceramic shards scattered like fallen teeth. Mark was standing over Leo, his face a mask of fury, his hand raised. Leo was cowering on the floor, his arms thrown over his head, sobbing. "What is going on?" Sarah demanded, her voice shaking. "This little brat just broke my favorite lamp," Mark bellowed, his finger jabbing in Leo's direction. "I told him not to throw his ball in the house. It was an accident," Leo wailed from beneath his arms. "I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't fix it." Mark took a menacing step forward. "Mark, stop." Sarah ran between them, putting herself in front of her son. She could feel the heat radiating from Mark's body, could smell the anger on him. "He's a child. It was an accident. He needs to learn a lesson," Mark snarled, his eyes blazing. She stood her ground, her body trembling but her resolve firm. For a moment, she thought he might push her aside, might strike them both. The violence in the air was a tangible thing, thick and suffocating. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, his expression changed. The rage receded, replaced by a look of weary exasperation. He ran a hand through his hair. You're right, he said, his voice dropping to a reasonable tone. I overreacted. I'm sorry, Sarah. I've had a stressful week. He looked down at Leo, who was still huddled on the floor. Come on, champ. Get up. It's okay. He offered a hand to Leo, but the boy flinched away, scrambling backward until he hit the wall. Mark's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second before he masked it with a sigh. See what you do, Sarah? You're making him soft. You're making him afraid of me. That night, after Leo was asleep, Mark apologized again. He was so convincing, so full of remorse. He brought her a glass of wine, rubbed her shoulders, told her he loved her, that he loved Leo as if he were his own. He explained that his own father had been a hard man, that he didn't always know how to control his temper, but that he was trying, for her, for their family. And Sarah, desperate for the dream to be real, had chosen to believe him. She swept up the broken pieces of the lamp, just as she was sweeping away the mounting evidence in her own mind. She told herself that all families had problems, that all parents got angry sometimes. Mark was right. She was probably being overprotective. She was probably making things worse. But the incidents continued to chip away at her denial. There was the time Leo came home from a boys-only fishing trip with Mark with a limp he claimed was from slipping on a rock. Yet, for weeks afterward, he would cry out in his sleep, his hands flying to his ribs. There was the time she overheard Mark's voice from Leo's bedroom, a low, venomous whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was like acid. When she opened the door, Mark was smiling, sitting on the edge of the bed, and Leo was pale and silent, his sheets pulled up to his chin. Just telling him a bedtime story, Mark had said smoothly, winking at her. The disconnect between the man Mark was in public charming, doting stepfather, and the man he was becoming behind closed doors was dizzying. To their friends, to her family, he was perfect. You're so lucky, Sarah, her own mother had said. He's a wonderful man, and he's so good to Leo. She would just smile, a hollow, brittle thing, the lie a bitter taste in her mouth. She started to feel like a prisoner in her own home, a spectator to a slow-motion tragedy she was powerless to stop. Her life had become a series of justifications, a litany of excuses she would repeat to herself in the dead of night. He's just stressed. He doesn't mean it. He loves us. He's a good man. She was clinging to the memory of the man she had fallen in love with, refusing to see the monster he was becoming, the monster her son was already seeing in his nightmares. The breaking point, the moment she could no longer pretend, came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Leo was home from school with a fever. Sarah had tucked him into her own bed, a rare treat, and he had fallen into a restless sleep. She was in the kitchen, making him some soup, when Mark came home early from work. He was in a foul mood, muttering about a deal that had fallen through. He saw Leo in their bed and his face darkened. Why is he in our bed? He demanded. He's sick, Sarah said quietly. I wanted to keep an eye on him. He's fine. He should be in his own room. You coddle him, Sarah. That's the whole problem. He strode into the bedroom. Sarah followed, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. Mark, please let him sleep. He ignored her. He walked to the bed and roughly shook Leo's shoulder. Get up, Leo. Go to your own room. Leo woke with a start, his eyes wide with fever and fear. He looked from Mark's angry face to his mother's pleading one. But Mommy said. He began, his voice weak. I don't care what your mommy said. I said go to your room. Now. Mark's voice was a thunderclap in the quiet room. He grabbed Leo's arm and hauled him out of the bed. Leo stumbled, his legs unsteady. Mark, stop it. You're hurting him, Sarah cried, rushing forward. Mark shoved her back. It wasn't a violent push, but it was firm, dismissive. A clear message. Stay out of this. He dragged Leo, who was now openly sobbing, towards the door. As they passed the dresser, Leo's flailing hand knocked over a framed picture. It was a photo of Sarah and a 3-year-old Leo, taken long before Mark, their faces bright with uncomplicated joy. It hit the floor with a crack. Something inside Mark snapped. With a roar of rage, he threw Leo away from him. The little boy's body hit the wall with a sickening thud. He slid to the floor, silent. For a moment, the world stopped. The only sound was the rain lashing against the window. Sarah stared, frozen, at her son's small, crumpled form on the floor. Then the spell broke. "Leo!" she shrieked, scrambling to his side. He was conscious, his breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps, but he didn't make a sound. He just stared at Mark with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. Mark stood over them, his chest heaving. He looked from Leo on the floor to Sarah's horrified face. He seemed to realize what he had done, the line he had so violently crossed. The fury drained from his face, replaced by a flicker of what looked like panic. "Sarah, I didn't mean," he stammered. But Sarah wasn't listening. She was running her hands over Leo's body, checking for injuries, murmuring his name over and over like a prayer. There was a red mark blooming on his cheek where he had hit the wall, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that there would be more bruises tomorrow, both visible and invisible. She gathered her son into her arms. He was trembling violently. She held him tight, trying to absorb the tremors into her own body, trying to shield him from the man who stood just feet away. She looked at Mark, and for the first time, she didn't see the handsome, charismatic man she had fallen in love with. She didn't see the provider, the partner, the man who was supposed to complete their family. She saw the monster from her son's nightmares. And in that horrifying moment of clarity, another, even more terrifying realization dawned on her. The monster hadn't just appeared. He had been there all along. And she, in her desperate, willful blindness, had unlocked the door and invited him in. She had stood by, silent and complicit, as he devoured the light in her son's eyes, piece by agonizing piece. The guilt was a physical thing, a crushing weight that threatened to suffocate her. She had failed him, and she knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that this was only the beginning. The worst was yet to come. She could feel it in the cold silence of the room, in the rain that beat against the glass like a mournful drum, in the terrifyingly empty gaze of her own child. In the aftermath of that rainy Tuesday, a new and terrible silence settled over the house. It was a silence born not of peace, but of fear. It clung to the furniture, lurked in the corners, and thickened the air they breathed. The home that Sarah had once filled with hope was now a fortress of secrets, and she was its unwilling, complicit warden. The unspoken truth of what Mark had done, of what he was capable of, became the foundation upon which their lives were now precariously built. Instead of leaving, instead of grabbing her son and running until the monster was just a bad memory, Sarah did the opposite. She stayed. The reasons were a tangled, suffocating web of fear, shame, and a twisted, desperate logic. Mark's remorse in the hours and days that followed the incident was a masterclass in manipulation. He wept. He begged for her forgiveness. He swore on his life, on his love for her, that it would never, ever happen again. He was a man under pressure, he explained, a man terrified of failing this new family he loved so much. His temper, he claimed, was a demon he wrestled with daily, a legacy from his own abusive father. He painted a picture of himself as a victim, too, and Sarah, her own resolve fractured by guilt and fear, found herself wanting to believe it. To leave would be to admit her own catastrophic failure, to declare to the world that she had invited a monster into her child's life. It would mean facing the pity and judgment of her family and friends, who all saw Mark as the perfect husband and stepfather. It would mean financial ruin, a return to the lonely, precarious existence of a single mother. Only this time she would be carrying the added weight of this horrific trauma. And so she made a choice. It wasn't a conscious decision, not a single moment of clear-eyed resolve. It was a slow, creeping capitulation, a series of small daily surrenders. She chose to believe Mark's promises of change. She chose to prioritize the illusion of a stable, happy family over the terrifying reality of her son's life. She chose to hide the truth. Her complicity began with a lie to the school. The next morning, The red mark on Leo's cheek had blossomed into a livid, purple bruise. It was impossible to hide. When the school nurse called, her voice laced with professional concern, Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. But the lie came easily, smoothly, as if she had been rehearsing it for weeks. "He fell," she said, her voice a perfect imitation of a worried mother. "He was running in the house with his socks on and slipped. Hit his cheek on the corner of the coffee table. You know how boys are." The nurse accepted the explanation, and with that first successful lie, a dark path opened up before Sarah. She had taken her first step. Life in the house transformed into a tense, carefully choreographed performance. Sarah became a hypervigilant observer, a master of de-escalation. She learned to read Mark's moods, to anticipate his triggers. She kept the house immaculately clean, ensured his dinner was on the table the moment he walked through the door, and steered Leo out of his path whenever he seemed irritable. She taught Leo to be quiet, to be invisible. "Don't bother Mark right now, sweetie. He's had a hard day," became her constant refrain. She was, in essence, training her son to survive his abuser. Leo, for his part, learned his lessons all too well. The boisterous, happy boy was gone, replaced by a ghost who drifted silently from room to room. He spoke in whispers, his eyes constantly darting towards Mark, gauging his reaction to every sound, every movement. He stopped asking to have friends over. He stopped talking about school. He stopped being a child. His world had shrunk to the four walls of his house, a prison where the warden was his mother and the executioner was his stepfather. The physical abuse became less frequent, but more insidious. Mark was smarter now. He no longer left marks on Leo's face. The bruises she would find were on his back, his stomach, his upper arms, places easily concealed by a t-shirt. The discipline now happened behind the closed door of Leo's bedroom. Sarah would stand outside, her hand pressed to her mouth to stifle her own sobs, listening to the muffled thuds, the sound of Mark's low, angry voice, and worst of all, Leo's choked, silent crying. He had learned not to scream. Screaming, he knew, made it worse. Each time, after the discipline was over, Mark would emerge, calm and composed. He would look at Sarah with a self-satisfied expression, as if he had just performed a necessary, if unpleasant, parental duty. "We had a good talk," he would say. "He understands now." And Sarah would nod, her stomach churning with a mixture of revulsion and relief that it was over. She tried to comfort Leo afterwards, to offer some semblance of maternal protection. She would go into his room and find him huddled on his bed, his face turned to the wall. She would try to hold him, to stroke his hair, but he would often flinch from her touch. Her comfort was a betrayal, a lie. How could she protect him from the monster when she slept in the monster's bed every night? Her love, once his greatest source of security, was now tainted by her complicity. He couldn't trust her. He couldn't trust anyone. The psychological torment was constant. Mark delighted in a cruel campaign of gaslighting and emotional abuse that was aimed at both of them. He would misplace Leo's favorite toys, only to find them in the trash days later, claiming Leo must have thrown them away and forgotten. He would set impossible rules and then punish Leo for failing to follow them. He would pit them against each other, telling Sarah that Leo had been saying disrespectful things about her, and telling Leo that his mother was disappointed in him, that she secretly wished he were a better son. He isolated them, severing their connections to the outside world. He discouraged Sarah from seeing her friends, complaining that they were a bad influence. He vetoed family gatherings, claiming he was too tired or that Leo wasn't behaving well enough to be taken out in public. The house became their entire world, a closed loop of fear and control. Sarah's own mind became a battlefield. Cognitive dissonance was her constant companion. She loved her son more than life itself, yet she was allowing him to be systematically destroyed. She knew what Mark was doing was monstrous, yet she would find herself defending him, making excuses for him, not just to others, but to herself. He provides for us. He can be so charming, so loving when he's in a good mood. Maybe if Leo were just better behaved. Maybe if I were a better wife. The lies she told herself were more insidious than the ones she told the school nurse. They were the poison she willingly drank every day to survive. She lived in a constant state of low-grade terror, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The sound of Mark's car in the driveway would send a jolt of adrenaline through her system. The tone of his voice on the phone could dictate the mood of her entire day. She was walking on eggshells, and she was forcing her son to walk on them, too. There were moments, brief flashes of her old self, when the fog of denial would clear and she would see the situation with horrifying clarity. One evening, she was helping Leo with a school project. They were building a diorama of a jungle, and for a few precious minutes it was like old times. Leo was animated, chattering away about anacondas and poison dart frogs, a tiny spark of his former self flickering to life. He laughed, a real, genuine laugh, and the sound was so foreign and so beautiful that it brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Mark walked into the room at that moment. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, watching them, his presence instantly sucking all the warmth and joy out of the room. Leo's smile vanished. He hunched his shoulders and fell silent, his attention suddenly glued to the plastic monkey in his hand. Later that night, Mark cornered Sarah in the kitchen. "He seems to have a lot of energy tonight," he said, his voice deceptively casual, laughing and carrying on. "I thought you said he was feeling down lately." "He was just happy, Mark," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Or maybe he's been playing you," he countered, stepping closer. "Maybe he acts all sad and pathetic to get your attention, and the minute my back is turned, he's laughing at both of us. You have to be smarter than that, Sarah. He's manipulative." He was twisting the one beautiful moment she had shared with her son into something ugly and manipulative. He was trying to poison her love, to make her an accomplice not just through her silence, but through her suspicion. And the most terrifying part was that a small, dark part of her almost believed him. Her reality was so warped that she was beginning to lose her own moral compass. The house itself seemed to absorb the misery within its walls. It became a house of whispers. Sarah would hear things in the dead of night, the floorboards creaking outside Leo's room, a low murmur from behind the closed door. She would see things, two fleeting shadows in her peripheral vision, the look of abject terror in her son's eyes when he thought she wasn't watching. Leo stopped speaking almost entirely, communicating in a series of shrugs and nods. The silence was his shield, his only defense. If he said nothing, he could say nothing wrong. One day, Sarah found a drawing Leo had hidden under his mattress. It wasn't the usual childish drawing of houses and suns. It was a chaotic swirl of black and red crayon, a furious, desperate scribble. In the center of the storm of color was a small, stick-figure boy, his mouth a perfect O of a silent scream, and towering over him was a large, dark shadow, a featureless figure with angry red eyes. Sarah stared at the drawing, her blood running cold. It was a portrait of their lives. It was her son's silent testimony, a cry for help that he was too terrified to utter aloud. She should have taken that drawing. She should have taken her son, and she should have run. She should have gone to the police, to her family, to anyone, and screamed the truth until her throat was raw. But she didn't. She carefully folded the piece of paper and tucked it back under the mattress. She went downstairs and started making dinner. She chopped the vegetables with a steady hand, her face a blank, emotionless mask. She called Mark and Leo to the table, and they ate in their customary, suffocating silence. She had seen the truth, rendered in the stark, honest crayon of her own child, and she had looked away. She had chosen the monster, and in doing so, she had sealed her son's fate. The silence in the house was no longer just an absence of sound. It was the sound of a little boy's soul being slowly, methodically extinguished. And she was standing by, holding the candle, and doing nothing as the flame flickered and died. The end came not with a roar, but with a chilling, final whisper. The weeks leading up to the last day of Leo's life were the quietest yet. It was a heavy, stagnant silence, the kind that precedes a storm. Mark had become more controlled, his outbursts of rage replaced by a cold, simmering hostility that was somehow more terrifying. He had perfected his reign of terror, achieving a state of total dominance through psychological warfare. Leo was a wraith, a pale, silent child who moved through the house like a ghost, his eyes holding the haunted, ancient look of a soul that had seen too much. Sarah was a hollowed-out version of herself, an automaton going through the motions of life. Her days were a blur of cooking, cleaning, and watching, always watching. She watched Mark for signs of anger. She watched Leo for signs of injury, for the silent pleas in his eyes that she continued to ignore. The guilt was a constant, physical presence, a leaden weight in her chest that made it difficult to breathe. She was a ghost, too, haunting the ruins of the life she had so spectacularly failed to protect. The final day started like any other. It was a Saturday in late autumn. The sky was a flat, unforgiving gray, and a cold wind stripped the last of the leaves from the trees. Mark announced that he was going to be working in the garage, a man's space where he and Leo would spend the day bonding. The word bonding sent a sliver of ice through Sarah's veins. These bonding sessions were always the worst. They were long stretches of time where Leo was alone with Mark, completely at his mercy, far from her useless, watchful eyes. She wanted to object, to make an excuse. Leo had a cough. He needed to finish a school project, but the words died in her throat. Protesting would only make Mark angry, and an angry Mark was a dangerous Mark. So, she just nodded, her face a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. "Okay," she said, her voice a stranger's. "Lunch will be at 1. She watched from the kitchen window as Mark led Leo to the detached garage at the back of the yard. Mark's hand was on the back of Leo's neck, not in a gesture of fatherly affection, but in a grip that was proprietary and menacing. Leo was walking with his head bowed, his small shoulders slumped in resignation. He didn't look back at the house. He never did anymore. The hours that followed were agonizing. The garage was too far away for her to hear anything clearly, but her mind filled the silence with horrors. Every clang of a tool, every rev of the lawnmower engine, sent a fresh wave of panic through her. She tried to distract herself by cleaning, scrubbing the kitchen floors with a frantic energy, as if she could wash away the filth that had permeated her life. But there was no escaping the truth. Her son was in a cage with a predator, and she had locked the door. At 1 o'clock, she carried a tray with sandwiches and lemonade out to the garage. Her hands were trembling. As she approached, she could hear Mark's voice, low and angry. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was all too familiar. She paused at the door, her heart pounding. She should turn back. She should pretend she hadn't heard. But for some reason, this time she didn't. She pushed the door open. The scene inside was one of quiet, methodical cruelty. Mark was standing over Leo, who was on his knees, trying and failing to coil a thick, heavy extension cord. His small hands were red and raw from the effort. A small puddle was spreading on the concrete floor around him. He had wet himself. "I told you to do it right." Mark was snarling, his voice a venomous whisper. "Look at this mess. You're useless. Absolutely useless. And now look what you've done. You're a disgusting little baby." Leo was shaking, tears streaming silently down his face, his eyes fixed on the impossible task in front of him. He didn't even seem to register his mother's presence. Mark looked up and saw Sarah standing in the doorway, the tray of food in her hands. His face, which had been contorted with rage, instantly smoothed into a mask of weary patience. "Ah, Sarah," he said, as if she had just walked in on a normal father-son activity. "Just trying to teach Leo some responsibility. But he's having a bit of trouble concentrating today." He gestured to the puddle on the floor with a look of disgust. "And he's had another accident. The boy has no control." Sarah stood frozen, the sandwiches and lemonade forgotten. The blatant, casual cruelty of it, the way he didn't even try to hide it anymore, finally broke through the thick walls of her denial. For a fleeting, incandescent moment, the woman she used to bait a fierce, protective mother surfaced. "Get away from him," she said, her voice low and shaking with a fury she hadn't felt in years. Mark's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. "I'm sorry," I said. "Get away from my son." She put the tray down on a workbench and walked towards them. She knelt down and put her arms around Leo, pulling him away from the extension cord, away from Mark. He was limp in her arms, his small body trembling. "Sarah, I think you're overreacting," Mark said, his voice taking on a warning edge. "We were just—" "I know what you were doing." She cut him off, her voice gaining strength. She held Leo tight and looked directly at Mark, her eyes blazing. "It's over, Mark. It's over." A strange expression passed over Mark's face. It wasn't anger. It wasn't remorse. It was something colder, something calculating. He stared at her, at the defiance in her eyes, at the way she was shielding her son, and he seemed to come to a decision. "You're right," he said, his voice suddenly calm, almost gentle. "I'm sorry. You're right. I've been under a lot of stress. Let's all go inside. We'll have lunch. We'll talk. We'll start over." His sudden capitulation was more unnerving than his anger. But Sarah, desperate to believe that her moment of courage had actually worked, allowed herself a sliver of hope. She helped Leo to his feet and, holding his hand in a tight grip, led him back to the house. Mark followed a few paces behind them, his footsteps silent on the damp grass. The rest of the afternoon was surreal. Mark was a different person. He was charming, attentive, apologetic. He helped Leo clean up, spoke to him in a soft, gentle voice, and even read him a story on the couch. Sarah watched him, her heart a confused, hopeful bird fluttering in her chest. Had she done it? Had she finally broken the spell? Maybe he had finally seen what he was doing, what he had become. Maybe they could be a family again. That evening, Mark insisted on putting Leo to bed. "Let me do it," he said to Sarah, his eyes full of earnest sincerity. "I need to make things right with him. I need to show him that I love him." Sarah hesitated for a moment, the old fear coiling in her stomach. But then she looked at Mark's pleading face, and she remembered the hope she had felt earlier. She needed to trust him just this once. If they were ever going to heal, she had to let him try. "Okay," she said, her voice soft. She stood in the hallway as Mark tucked Leo into bed. She could hear him talking, his voice a low, soothing murmur. He was telling him a bedtime story. She couldn't hear the words, but the cadence was gentle. After a few minutes, he started to sing a lullaby, a song his own mother used to sing to him. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. This was the man she had fallen in love with. He was still in there. Everything was going to be okay. She went into the living room and sat on the couch, a profound sense of relief washing over her. The silence from Leo's room was peaceful, for once. Mark came out a few minutes later, a soft smile on his face. "He's asleep," he whispered, sitting down next to her. He took her hand. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. For everything. I promise you, from this day forward, things will be different." She leaned her head on his shoulder, exhausted but hopeful, and allowed herself to believe him. They sat like that for a long time, in the quiet, dimly lit living room. Eventually, Sarah's own exhaustion took over, and she drifted off to sleep, her head still on her husband's shoulder. She woke with a start a few hours later. The house was cold and utterly silent. Mark was no longer beside her. A sudden, inexplicable sense of dread seized her. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. "Mark?" she called out, her voice thick with sleep. No answer. She got up and went to their bedroom. It was empty. She checked the bathroom. Empty. Her heart began to beat a frantic, panicked rhythm. She ran to Leo's room and pushed open the door. The room was dark. The only light was a sliver from the hallway, falling across the small bed. Leo was lying on his back, his favorite teddy bear tucked under his arm. He looked like he was sleeping peacefully. "Leo?" she whispered, walking towards the bed. "Sweetie, are you awake?" She reached out to touch his cheek. It was cold, ice cold. A primal scream built in her throat, but it wouldn't come out. Her mind refused to process what her senses were telling her. She shook his shoulder, gently at first, and then more violently. "Leo, wake up. Leo!" But he didn't move. His eyes remained closed. His small chest did not rise and fall. The sweet, peaceful expression on his face was a lie. It was the stillness of forever. She stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth, and then she saw it. On his bedside table, next to his lamp, was an empty glass and a small, unlabeled bottle that hadn't been there before. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with the force of a physical blow. Mark's sudden change in demeanor, his insistence on putting Leo to bed, the bedtime story, the lullaby, the long, peaceful silence. It hadn't been an act of contrition. It had been an act of premeditation. He hadn't been making things right. He had been saying goodbye. He had seen the defiance in her eyes in the garage and had known, with cold certainty, that his reign was over. He had lost control. And if he couldn't have them, couldn't control them, then he would destroy the one thing she loved more than anything. He had waited until her guard was down, until she was seduced by a false hope, and then he had committed the ultimate act of cruelty. He hadn't just killed her son. He had made her a party to it, lulling her to sleep in the next room while he poisoned her child. The scream finally tore itself from her throat, a raw, ragged sound of a soul being ripped in two. She collapsed to the floor, the sound of her own keening wails filling the silent, dead house. The truth, which she had so desperately hidden for so long, had finally come out. It had come out in the form of an empty glass, a cold cheek, and a silence that would last for eternity. The monster had won. He had taken everything, and she, in her cowardice and her complicity, had held the door open for him, and had even wished him a good night.